I learned recently that he'd died some years ago. I will confess that his was one of those obituaries that, to quote the old line, you do not celebrate, but which you read with a certain satisfaction. He was probably my least liked professor ever, and that is in the face of rather stiff competition, particularly later when I was in graduate school. He taught creative writing, or at least he pretended to, in the dusty little desert city at the edge of the American Southwest in which I spent my undergraduate years. At that time, which, I shudder to realize, was half a century ago now, he was a young man, somewhere in his 40s, come to teach at the university as the, quote, token non-degree man, unquote, and to be its writer in residence. I don't know whether he detested the job, or the university, or just us, his students. Certainly we loathed him, and with reason. Not to put too fine a point on it, he was a bully and abusive. He would mock us and our attempts to write fiction in public, that is, in his classes, and in private during student conferences he was actually worse, suggesting that we do ourselves and the world a big favor by never putting pen to paper again. I later learned that we weren't so special, us students. He could be almost as abusive to his colleagues as he was to us. Not quite, but almost. He was never exactly rude to them, but he gave the impression that he regarded them all as unimportant, shadowy figures, impotent weaklings who concern themselves with useless things like 18th century literature, whereas he was vital and creative and full of energy. He was the robust Hemingway to their cloistered and ineffectual Henry James. I suppose on some level he did have a point. They were small-town provincial academics, just as we were small-town kids, the desert rats, whose hopes of careers as authors were at best pathetic and at worst ridiculous, whereas he genuinely had had an adventurous life. We knew something about him. We could read his biography on the backs of his published books, all 2 of them, and he regularly confided in the 2 or 3 students who were his favorites, and they shared their news about him with the rest of us. He'd been born into an affluent family, not to say wealthy, though that was true. Then he'd gone to the most Ivy of all Ivy League schools, where he met people who later went on to careers in publishing, and who, later still, published him. He had a brief career as a wartime journalist, though never too close to the front lines. Then he'd left that and gone to New York City, where, I gather, he lived a bit of a bohemian life, and a rather glittering one at that. He knew, or at least said he knew, and I see no reason to doubt him, a remarkable circle of individuals. Truman Capote, for one, whom he admired, Joan Didion before she went to California, Norman Mailer, Tom Wolfe, though I gather he detested new journalism. Supposedly, too, he had some connections with individuals orbiting Andrew Warhol, notably Edie Sedgwick, though it was never clear if he really knew her or simply met her once or twice. And also, supposedly, at one point along the way, he was into the Greenwich Village folk scene, not as a participant, but as a regular fan. There was even a rumor that he'd seen Mary Travers at Café Wa when she was a waitress there. But I'm not sure I believe that one. The timing doesn't work. But even if only a fraction of these stories is true, it was an amazing life he'd had. I envied him enormously, and I wondered why on earth he might have left that life, so full of light and adventure, and come to us in the city of dust. He didn't need the money. He was a trust fund baby. And even if he hadn't been, and had needed the money, well, he wouldn't have come to us. Not even back in the 1960s did anyone get rich as an academic, particularly not at a community college. There were stories that he had fled a scandal, that he'd done something terrible in New York and had fled here in search of sanctuary and oblivion. But I don't believe those stories. They have the air of envy about them, and they are too convenient and too melodramatic. It wouldn't even surprise me to learn that he started them himself, created gossip about himself for the drama of it all. No. But I did finally figure it out. Years later, when I was no longer in school and he could no longer get at me, I found copies of his 2 published books in a used bookstore. I bought them, took them home, and read them closely, far more closely than I had when I'd first known him, and been, in my foolish way, impressed by him. He, after all, was a real writer, even if he belittled me. And you know what? The books were pretty mediocre, really. Bland, uninteresting. He was a minimalist, which I can respect, but he was fantastically so. His writing was so simple, so sparse, that it seemed to lack any adjectives, or sometimes even vowels. His characters were all exactly alike, all graduates of Harvard or Yale, all at midpoints in their lives and careers, all suffering from some sort of ill-defined spiritual malaise. They all talked alike, they all acted alike, they all faced the same problems, and all of their marriages were failing, spectacularly, for no discernible reason. At that moment, I understood. I knew why he'd fled his betters and his life in the East and come to us, we poor sods in the outer darkness. He was in search of immortality. Let me explain. At some point, somewhere along the way, he too must have read his own works closely. And it must have been quite a shock. Simply put, he wasn't much good, not too talented. And he'd realized that it was never going to get better for him. He was not a great writer. He was never going to be the next Hunter S. Thompson or Norman Mailer or whoever. He was never going to be inspired. He must have realized as well that he had gotten where he was not because of his talents, but because of his connections. All those young men he'd known in college who'd become middle-aged publishers and who would eventually, someday, retire and thus deprive him of any markets anywhere. And he knew, consciously or otherwise, that he would never achieve lasting fame. Not by his works, anyway. He would not be remembered, not by the critics, not by the readers, not even by his friends, of whom there were few. But there was an alternative, and that was us. We who had been his students. We would remember him, not happily, but we would recall him. We'd recall his cruelty, his wounding comments, his cutting wit, his brilliant, calculated sadism on all occasions. Oh, yes, we certainly would not forget him, for as long as we lived, he would be with us, living rent-free in our heads, always hearing his hateful, sneering voice whenever we turned to our typewriter or word processor, always seeing the scrawled red ink of his cutting remarks when we tried to proof our own writing, even if it was nothing more important than paying a bill or doing a shopping list. Oh, yes. We could overcome him, of course. We could force ourselves to ignore his memory. We could make ourselves write or create. We could ignore the voice he'd planted in our heads, but we would not forget him. Memory cannot be erased. For so long as we live for the rest of our lives, a part of him would remain alive as well. If he had no friends, no fans, then at least he would have his enemies, and in the warmth of their hatred he would bask forever and ever. Thus, as I'm sure he thought, he conquered death itself. But did he? For there's the rub. That was all 50 years ago. I am myself already in my late 60s. With luck, and I hope I get it, I'll make it another 20 years or so. But still, I and we, all his former students, plus the other men and women he deliberately offended, we grow old. We grow old. Shall we wear the bottoms of our trousers rolled? Dare we eat a peach? Eventually. Not soon, but in the end, we too shall go. And with each of our passings, another part of him will perish, one by one, bursting into nothing like a bubble, dispersing like a fart upon the wind. So, in the end, in the passing of time, he will be no more. And each of us, in our own small ways, we will have been among his assassins. Each of us carrying some small part of him to the grave. What better vengeance could we seek? And there is a lesson here, a moral to the story. To wit, love is, I hope, we all hope, eternal. But hate? That's another story entirely. Hate, like mice and men, is merely mortal and gains in time the oblivion it so richly deserves.